Well, good morning, Charleston, and good morning, all the virtual Charlestons, wherever you are all around the world. I'm Jim O'Donnell, University Librarian at Arizona State University, and it's my privilege and honor and personal pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker this morning. Distinguished senior scholar and seasoned administrator, Joy Connolly is in her third year now as president of the American Council of Learned Societies. ACLS brings together the learned societies in the humanities and humanistic social sciences to do the work of worry about our profession and to act to make things better for our scholars, for our teachers, especially for our rising scholars, and of course, for our students. Joy has taught at the University of Washington, at Stanford, and at NYU. She's held leadership roles as Dean of Humanities at NYU, and then as provost and, for her sins, interim president at the City University Graduate Center in New York, where she did very innovative work on supporting PhD education at a critical time in the humanities. She's taken a particular interest in building support in all her responsibilities, but especially now at ACLS, building support for humanities research and teaching in what are obviously challenging times, and in finding ways to do so that increase and strengthen the inclusiveness of the humanities for all the populations we serve, all the populations to which we are responsible. She has led ACLS through its first ever real fundraising campaign, coming in well over target. We're getting a nice party out of that pretty soon. And she's also emerged as a leading voice for the humanities in American society. She brings us her voice today to help us think about how libraries can make our traditional alliance with the humanities stronger and more effective. She has a simple message for us in the title of her talk, but it has hidden depths. She's here to tell us to think different. Joy, welcome to Charleston.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for that wonderful introduction. And it's wonderful to see people. This is my first kind of large-scale talk in over 18 months, and I'm being confronted with the typical challenges of how to balance a bottle of water on a tilted podium and how to see people in a dark room with whom you're trying to connect. But it's good to be reminded of these challenges and really wonderful to be in person again and talking with each other physically as well as virtually. And one of our challenges at ACLS and all our learned society partners is to think through how to make the most of what we've learned through the pandemic. I know you're all thinking about this too. So it's a great live experience for me to be here with you here in Charleston, speaking in this hybrid context. It's obviously, and it kind of hardly needs saying, how difficult a time it is for so many people around the world in this country, especially humanist academics, especially the large numbers of contingent faculty, adjuncts, people without decently paid full-time employment, who yet are absolutely devoted to the production and circulation of vital knowledge. Your role in the production and circulation of vital knowledge that the world needs has really never felt more important to so many people. And so I want to thank you for that and acknowledge how at times fragile this work feels to us at ACLS, given the demands of the world, the challenges facing the world, the demands made on so many people, and how stretched I think we all feel for time. So thank you for your efforts, and I'm going to ask, as I ask you to think different with me, I know I want to start with on the ground of shared respect and indeed love of the work that we produce, the research, the scholarship that we produce and try to support together, even though I'm going to ask some, I hope, tough and provocative questions about how we do that and how we can do it in the future. Let me explain a little bit as I start where I'm coming from, because ACLS, not to be confused with the ACLU, is an organization that people know something about, maybe, but a lot of people don't know a lot about, possibly. So I'll just tell you that we are a networked organization. We've been around for a little over 100 years. We work mainly through using our convening power to bring people together, people in all sectors of academia, as we seek to support the humanities and social sciences. A couple of examples of our achievements, just to give you a sense of the scale in which ACLS has sought to work over over the last century. We were instrumental in working with partners in Phi Beta Kappa and a couple of other organizations in getting the Monuments Men started. You may have seen the movie with, I think, Matt Damon, but don't quote me on that. But that was an effort to preserve monuments in Western Europe, paintings, artworks, something that ACLS got going when scholars realized the devastation that was facing museums and galleries and collections all over the battlefields of Europe at that time. In the 60s, again, working with Phi Beta Kappa and the Council for Graduate Schools, ACLS formed a commission that then formed the basis of the paper that convinced Congress to establish the NEH. So it's with pretty high standards that we look back and we think about what we can do now to assist humanistic scholarship, lift it up and support it in the right ways as we move into the future. Last kind of setup comment about the network, to give you a sense of the texture of the people ACLS works with. We work directly with the executive directors and staffs of our 78 constituent societies, and that's everything from the American Historical Association and the Modern Language Association, which have thousands and thousands of members, all the way to the Society for Austrian Studies, which is doughty but small with just a few hundred members. We work across that whole range. We work closely with deans and some faculty in our ACLS Research University Consortium, which is we can describe it as mostly AAU member schools. And then we have a larger associate network of about 250 colleges and universities, including community colleges and HBCUs and minority serving institutions. That's been the focus of our most intensive efforts to create community, particularly for humanities administrators and humanities chairs who don't have a natural way to connect and strategize together, which is really one of the problems we see, that I can summarize the situation facing academia with concerns about budget cuts and reductions as one where fascinating, great creative people are doing great things, but in a fragmented system that isn't very well interconnected, and where in many cases, because of concerns about rankings and resources, school leaders are often afraid to be the first to leap. So there are lots of constraints on action, but there is no shortage of action and good ideas for change. So my overall point, again, in setting this up, is to say that I've seen and worked in throughout my career to date with a lot of different types of people, faculty, staff, and students in different sectors of academia, and we continue to do so here. And I'm very eager to take what I learn at this conference out to those networks and spread the good work around. So I don't want to say too many things that you already know, but I have to say at least one that you know much better than I do. And that is that thanks to the explosion of digital technology, knowledge, or at least information, has never been more accessible to more people today as it is today. And this is a brave new world. Again, speaking in cliches, you know all this. It's brought problems with it, problems of unequal access, digital deserts, not to mention the cognitive and epistemological challenges of evaluation and judgment. What counts as reliable knowledge or reliable information or data, what doesn't? But these are not the problems I want to tackle today. I really want to talk about the fact that while more and more people have access to more and more information, scholarship, humanistic scholarship at the most well-resourced and influential colleges and universities has become more and more highly specialized. Now, many scholars, particularly scholars of color, women, scholars who are first in their families to go to college, immigrant scholars, they would put it a lot more bluntly than what I just said. They would say, and they're joined by white men and others, and I don't mean to be exclusive, but I hear these voices that have been historically marginalized more loudly these days. They would say they feel more pressure to produce ever more specialized knowledge. It comes from the top. They feel that they're being pressured to write in an artificial language that limits their audience and impact, and that alienates them from their own chosen profession. And they're asking why. So imagine a case of to be familiar to all of you and to some degree. Imagine the case of an assistant professor who's coming up for tenure in a couple of years in the humanities. She's revising her dissertation for publication as a monograph. Now, think about a real life situation. She has had 2 years of a visiting assistant professorship in 2 different parts of the country with heavy teaching responsibilities. And she's now in her 4th year on the tenure track in my thought experiment. That means her first book is deriving from work she filed as a dissertation 6 years ago on the basis of research she started at least 2 years before that. So in her spare moments, she spends a lot of time wondering, must this project be a book? Do I have to keep working on this? What are the alternatives? Who can I talk to? How can I think different? I chose my title with intentional reference, dating myself, to the famous Apple ad of 1997. It was written collaboratively at a moment when the company was coming out of a very bad spot. If anyone remembers those black Next computers. Jim, I'm wondering if you actually had one of those.
It got stolen, but yes.
I had a memory. The ad, as you might remember, featured shots of Gandhi and Amelia Earhart, Martin Luther King, and Alfred Hitchcock, among others. And I'm going to quote the text in full, and I'll explain why. It's not long. The text ran like this. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Now, call this a monument to Steve Jobs' egoism, call it, he claimed he wrote the ad at one point, which was not true, call it a brilliant exercise in commercial ad making, but I know I'm not alone, kind of cutting to the heart of its message, in having originally been drawn to academia, partly because I saw it precisely as the only haven I could think of for the crazy ones, for the misfits, the ones who try to pull the culture forward, the ones who don't fit into conventional office culture, who love to dive into ideas and get new thinking into circulation. And it's people like this, and sticking with my assistant professor example, she's one of these people, and in my thought experiment, she is experiencing a rude awakening. She cares about her book, she cares about the work she's put into it, but she's really wondering whether it represents the best of what she has to offer the world. And she's thinking, why is it that even incremental change seems beyond the ken of the system I'm in? I acknowledge, again, I'm talking about R1, R2, elite liberal arts universities. I'm not talking about the whole system, I'm talking about just one piece of it. But the effects filter down, the value systems filter down and around, I should say, and up and around. So this assistant professor I'm imagining, I'm almost finished with this example, is thinking, wouldn't our project reach more readers as a podcast or an essay with links to online data or a collaborative project with a colleague? What would that look like? Now, meanwhile, let me fill out some other aspects of her experience in the COVID world. The online teaching she resisted when the pandemic started has actually turned out to turn her on to new possibilities when it comes to creating and circulating knowledge. She's found out that the public library in her community has created an online series to replace in-person public readings, and she's thinking about submitting a lecture to that series. She's thinking, how might my expertise advance the library's effort to help readers understand, say, literary genres, where the detective novel came from, for example. But as she considers pitching a lecture, of course, she feels nervous and guilty because she's spending time on something other than the book. And same with other opportunities to have more impact as an educator during this time of crisis. Say she meets a teacher at a local high school who asks if he can sit in her online class, and she starts thinking, can our university extend some online courses to him and his colleagues or other non-matriculated students? Could she actually learn from teachers who really know how to keep adolescents engaged? Something college teachers don't spend a lot of time learning, certainly not in graduate school. Could she play a role in bridging the institution of college, university, and high school, creating a new relationship that would extend beyond the immediate situation? Maybe there's a research group in there that she could set up and that would reanimate her energy and engage the community, as the mission statement in her university proudly proclaims, and also to serve a larger good. She reviews all these possibilities and she thinks, no, what counts is what, for tenure, what counts for promotion, what counts for keeping her health insurance, keeping her full-time job, is what university presses publish, what fills library shelves. So again, I'm not telling you, I think, much or anything that you don't already know, but I really feel strongly that the problem needs to be articulated so that we can together collectively solve it. The reward system in place in academia, as I've made clear in this sector of academia, leaves our professor no choice. There's really almost no room to think different. A live as she is to how she might learn from and grow with people, especially people outside the academy, our assistant professor is probably going to follow the advice of her senior colleagues to keep her head down, publish the book, wait till she gets tenure, and then she can explore these new possibilities. And she'll probably be told there's plenty of time. You have your whole life ahead of you after you get tenure. But there is not time. There isn't time. We are out of time when it comes to these careers, especially of these young people. In addition to the hiring slowdowns we're seeing, we've really got to ask if the purpose of research is to enrich understanding, why is the central requirement for tenure at so many research universities and elite colleges so inflexible? What can we do to change that? So don't get me wrong. I feel like I have to, again, I want to be respectful. I'm not hedging, but I want to be respectful of the effort and passion that go into creating books. I've produced two myself. I'm writing a third this year. It's due in 12 months. I love books. Books are good things. They're amazing things. But what I want to see and what I want to encourage us to think together about is a more flexible approach to defining what counts, what's meaningful, what's valuable in the production and circulation of knowledge. And this really means thinking different in the institution of higher education about promotion and tenure. But it also requires thinking different with people like you, because right now we have an unmissable chance, I think, to listen and learn from the experience of listening and learning from our students and online communities that the pandemic has exposed us to. So now is really the time, I think, to ask these tough questions about the ever higher value being placed on highly specialized research while our undergraduate audiences dissolve and our public audiences evaporate. This September, ACLS won, I'm very happy to say, a $3.5 million grant from the NEH to support publicly engaged scholarship. It's a big deal for our organization because we haven't traditionally been active in this sphere. And you can get a sense of the kinds of work we hope to support from a terrific 2008 paper by Timothy Eatman and Julie Ellison. It's called Scholarship in Public. It was published by the terrific collective Imagining America, and it's housed at the Syracuse University website. And some of the projects they talk about, and I'm embroidering some recent developments from work that I've seen as I describe them. I'll just give you 4 examples. And I want us to think about how do we translate this into something libraries and presses can engage in, preserve, find new forms for circulating and preserving and valuing. So public history of slavery, a local public history, including the investigation and self-reflection on community history that was undertaken at Brown University under the leadership of President Ruth Simmons. It's become a model for action at many universities and cities and towns around the country. Second example, an animating democracy project through critical writing about civically engaged art that engages the members of the community in reflection about the ways public space is used and monuments. Most recently, the Mellon Foundation has given a huge boost to this work because in their memorializing and monuments projects. The third example, urban studies, dear to my heart for reasons I don't have time to go into, but engaging communities, again, together with academics, with anthropologists, historians, architects, planners, in questions of preservation, heritage, and development. How do we create living documents that preserve the evolution of people's thinking about questions right in front of them in terms of the lived life and built environment of their communities? And fourth, museum-based history focused on, community history focused on immigrant labor, on the experience of women, on the experience of marginalized communities. Nancy Cantor, who was then president of Syracuse when this paper by Julie Ellison and Tim Eatman was produced, she's now president of Rutgers Newark, and Stephen Levine, who was then president of the Cal Institute of the Arts, they wrote a preface to this report in which they dwelled on the deep and close connection between supporting a wide spectrum of what counts as humanistic scholarship and retaining a diverse faculty and graduate student population. Many faculty members, they wrote, experience a frustrating clash between their intellectual goals, which include pursuing community-based scholarship in art making and institutional tenure policies. I often think of the scholarship we do kind of as a house. The foundations were laid a long time ago. The first walls were built by scholars of earlier generations. Later ones were added on. And as the house gets bigger, it stops being, I think, a place where people actually live. It stops being a place for people to be. It becomes a thing of beauty that we preserve for its own sake. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. It's a beautiful thing. We paint the house, we decorate it, we build porches and parapets, we build our towers as high as we can just to see how high we can build them, because we can. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that the house of scholarship is a house for people to live in. It's a place for people to be. One of the most exciting developments in academia that I've seen over the last 30 years is the way scholars have been approaching the problem of how to invite people into the house of scholarship. In fact, when I was a graduate student in the 90s, the model was very much exactly that. How do we invite people in? How do we invite people in, right? All these binaries, all these oppositions. Now, really, the paradigm has changed, and I think much for the better. We understand, I think we've come to understand, or we're gradually understanding, that when you open the doors wide enough, you realize the problem is no longer, or maybe never was, opening the doors. It's about redesigning the whole house. So from a house whose doors we push open, I think we're moving to something closer to a stoa, a row of open columns, or a hutong neighborhood, or even a cleared field with boundary stones so people can figure out where they are, where scholars can work with many different kinds of people, speakers of indigenous languages, communities eager to collaborate in writing the history of their own place, people trying to imagine a better world and trying to understand the past and the ways people use language and arts as they do so. So scholars have been doing this work for a long time. For many reasons, as I've said, much of the scholarly work in this area tends to fall under the radar of the reward system of academia. And I see my work at ACLS with my colleagues as developing along two paths. And first, we're trying to find ways to identify, to lift up, to reward that work that's responding to social needs and engages people as co-creators of knowledge outside the academy. This doesn't mean that, and I want to be really clear about this, that the work we seek to support has to be relevant, has to directly address a wicked problem of the world. One of the most interesting things I think ACLS can do is help people who work on topics that feel very separate. Use words that I don't typically like to use, like arcane or obscure or irrelevant. But if we can and we are finding people who are, with a little bit of help, can become very good at I'm making this motion because I think of it as a ball bouncing, connecting the bounces of the ball from the idea that originally animated their own interest, the question that animated their interest in whatever subject it might be, and the ways in which it can spur new thinking about the world in which we live or the past that we're contending with, the baggage we carry. So this isn't about a turn to public scholarship that's all about issues of the day and all about solving wicked problems like climate change or public health challenges, and that's certainly part of it. But there's also, I would say, equally and maybe even more interesting intellectual challenge of helping people who are working on less obviously connected topics to make the connections and illuminate our understanding in some very unexpected ways. So that's the first way in which we're working. And the second is we're really actively trying directly to change the reward structure of academia so that this work is recognized and lifted up. So I want to spend the last few minutes I have with you before we turn to questions describing a project that I am running with my Vice President, James Schulman, maybe known to some of you as the founder of Art Store, wonderful colleague. The two of us together really are running what we call, thanks to the generosity of the Luce Foundation, who's funding this effort, the Luce Design Workshop for a New Academy. What we did with this was we pulled together teams from 6 different schools, and I'll see if I can reel them off. The University of Pittsburgh, Washington University, Stony Brook University, part of the SUNY system, UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, and the College of William and Mary. And the teams from each of these 6 schools had to comprise a dean, because we wanted to have someone in place who could advance and accelerate the project, which I'll describe in a second, who had enough institutional pull to make change happen. But the group also had to include at least one graduate student, at least one contingent or non-tenure track faculty member, a tenured faculty member, ideally someone with chair experience. This doesn't mean we captured the whole texture of the university. Obviously, we had no undergraduate students, we had no staff. We talked a lot about whether we should have included someone from the budget side in this team and in its next iteration, which we're planning now. I think we will do that. But we focused on trying to get as much of the texture and variation of academic career paths and stages in these groups. And what did they have to do? We hired a design thinking consultant who's worked with a lot of corporations in the media world and the internet world, also with a lot of nonprofits. And she was incredibly bracing for us because she put us through over the 4 full day workshops, 4 days of quite intensive work online. She really put us through the ringer of thinking through using these highly artificial constructed design thinking exercises to not admire the problem, because academics are so good at admiring the problem, but tackling the question of how can we expand the impact and reach of humanistic and social scientific knowledge? How can we address questions of falling enrollments, declining numbers of majors? How can we tackle the specialization problem? And she forced us in a process not everyone loved, I have to say, although people came to terms with it, to identify a mechanism, a thing that would in their local campus do something to solve part of the problem. Not all of it, because all the problems we were talking about were huge, but some piece, whether it be the formation of a humanities lab that was designed in an unusual way, whether it be a carefully designed effort to change tenure requirements, that's the project a couple of schools are pursuing, a project to change the way, in a change that sounds very small, but actually is very far reaching, change the way doctoral students are advised. So those are some of the examples of the processes that these teams devised and that they're now putting in place. So our next steps with that are partly, I'm doing one right now. We're talking to people about it. We're getting the word out there. I've talked to the AAU graduate deans, the Council for Graduate Schools PhD Reform Group was actually collaborated with us in this project. We're setting up a series of public events and writing a couple of short pieces about this experience. We want to make it not quite a real-time, real life, this is how you change a university step by step on a blog, although we would like to do that. But we're trying to come up with some distillations of distilled pieces of our experience in trying to open up the academy for thinking differently. So this whole experience leads me to ask you, or to put before you 3 suggestions and ask for your feedback on them, because I think that libraries and presses are already advancing this evolution of thinking. I can hear that in the way that my collaborators and partners in all these efforts talk about their local work and where their ideas come from. But I do think we can work together in more depth and have more impact with more collaboration. So here, very briefly, are my 3 suggestions for work towards the future as we tackle this question of how we can expand what counts and think differently. First, people may no longer think of libraries as the place to go for knowledge, as Tony Grafton, who I've known for such a long time, has very eloquent things to say about the library as a literal building where knowledge was, and you would go to it like a magnet drawing you. Now people look at their computers or their phones or iPads for that, as well as the library. But libraries, of course, still have experts. They still have large buildings on campus that are amazing resources, and they still have sophisticated virtual spaces that could help people connect, including non-academics and academics, people outside the classroom, outside the academy, in something of a more centralized way to help those faculty who are often in little centers or individual departments, reinventing the wheel as they try to engage in the work of co-created scholarship with very few resources that they know about. So the library as a center for the co-creation of knowledge. Second suggestion question. Library presses, I think, could join more visibly in the effort of developing forms and resources of digital and public-facing and collaborative scholarship. And I know all that is happening now. I want to add what I myself don't yet quite see happening to the degree I would like it to happen, and that is that libraries and presses engage with scholars and administrators on metrics questions. questions about how we measure progress so that we can expand that book for tenure model and look to what community colleges are measuring, look to what regional comprehensives are measuring, look to what we want to reward. And thirdly, and finally, I think we can work together on the problem of unequal access to digital information by exploring models like subscribe to open books. And this is a huge, very messy topic, very complicated, but I do want to take this opportunity to say to you here, all of you here personally and virtually, that ACLS is very eager to learn more, having, we used to run the humanities ebooks, now very ably run by the University of Michigan Press. We have a deep vested interest in scholarly publishing and issues of navigating, how best to navigate open access is very much in our minds. So that is the third suggestion question I want to put out there. I will stop there. I hope this was useful. Thank you for your time, and I want to open it up to questions.
Joy, thank you. I will be looking at the Pathable chat for questions. We also have a microphone out here, and the lights are so bright that we'll need you to shout out a little bit if you're there trying to get our attention. That makes it a little better, but still, we'll need that. A couple of footnotes people were asking for, Joy, scholar to scholar, but one of them was asking about the name of your loose project. I think we have that already in the chat, but let me see. The
design workshop for a new academy.
Loose design workshop for a new academy. And the public scholarship report you referred to, could you say that again?
Yes. Yes, Julie Ellison and Tim Eatman produced that project, and it is published by Imagining America. It's on the Syracuse University website, and the paper is called Scholarship in Public. It's very easy to Google.
Nothing resonated so much in what you were saying in terms of the chat as your observation that the routine, the ordinary, the getting tenure, the fighting it out, can be a nuisance. Corinne Forstott-Burke says, yes, performance faculty are often required to publish in addition to their performance activities. There's a value on print over all else, problematic and or other altogether misplaced in many disciplines within the arts. Could you maybe say a word more about how you've seen people succeed in defeating the ordinary and the routinization that comes with that? I'll have a Charleston story after you comment.
Yes, yeah, but I'll add a little bit of nuance to the challenge. Many of the deans I'm talking to and faculty I'm talking to who are interested in changing tenure requirements, they point to the what my colleague at the Society of Biblical Literature, John Kutzko, has very brilliantly called the fact that academia is a systemless system. We're a system that's not a system. We function in some ways like a system, but we don't really have the functional interlocking parts that make us a truly workable system. A good example of this is the tenure file when an assistant professor has one's ducks all in place, an understanding and supportive department, an understanding and flexible and willing to experiment tenure committee and dean, understanding and flexible and creative and willing to think different, provost and president, and perhaps even a board, depending on how activist the board is, even when all these ducks are in line and there's an atmosphere of acceptance, or at least of an invitation to experiment. There still is that moment when the systemless system crashes into sight. And that's when the requests for external letters go out. And these 6 or 8 or 10 or 12, and the number gets higher and higher every year, I feel, these requests for letters go out, and they go out into the ether with people who have no idea about the state of conversation at a given university about flexibility and expanding what counts for tenure. And they look at the file and they look at the arts portfolio that doesn't have what they think of as the requisite number of publications. And they say, how can you possibly think about tenuring this person? This person isn't ready. This person's gone off the rails. This really happens. It's happening right now somewhere in the country. I guarantee it. So that is, so the solution, and what I have seen work to end this answer, not on a bleak note, is when deans and tenure committees are very forthright in saying, but you need all the support lined up. You really need, because this is a public communication and it involves, the quality of the faculty and the nature of the faculty. All needs to be lined up in advance, but it needs to be said in that request, we are valuing tenure differently. We are approaching the process of tenure differently. We are accepting and valuing a range of, with some examples. It is being done. It has been done. The Ooey Pooey network, the changes, adding, and I'm smiling, but it's very serious. The changes to the tenure system there, in which the faculty members' contribution to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we have a ways to go in thinking through how to get these requirements right, and not make them another part of the mechanical machine, but the intention is good there and it's promising.
So if you are participating in this conference, you are unwittingly participating in a tenure campaign that began 41 years ago. I was talking to our founder, Katina Strauch, the other night, and she said the first conference in Charleston with about 25 people was something she put together because they told her that hosting a conference would be good for her chances for tenure. So thank you all for continuing to support that, that tenure case. I think we have someone at the microphone, and then I'll go back to the chat.
My name is Chris Ferguson. I'm the interim dean of libraries at Murray State University. And actually the comments that you've just made are very related to the question that I had, which is these questions about what counts for tenure and how universities and faculty look at what their colleagues are doing, and what they're willing to count. How much, in your experience, about what faculty are willing to accept and then not accept is impacting junior faculty members' decision to stay in academia. So how much are we seeing faculty decide to either leave academia altogether or to accept non-tenure track positions, to move to a non-teaching position because the work that they want to do and they're motivated to do isn't valued by the colleagues and the deans and administrators above them?
That's a really good question. And I wish I had a more optimistic answer, but through another initiative at ACLS that we got funding for when I began, it was the first project I went to the Mellon Foundation and asked for funding for. This is something we call the Intention Foundry. It is a group of mostly emerging scholars, current people finishing their dissertations, mostly a few years out from the PhD, all scholars of color, largely women, as I think about the composition. And what we're doing is pulling executive directors of learned societies, so the director of MLA or the director of AHA, along with one or two scholars from those disciplines, and holding a series of meetings where we really dig deep into exactly, this question really dominates the discussion. And we haven't conducted surveys broad scale. That's very hard to do. Individual societies, though, this is one of the reasons we designed the Intention Foundry as we did, because individual societies were telling us that they needed better ways to connect with emerging scholars writ large, especially scholars of color, whom they could see just levels of impatience and frustration and anger rising to irrecoverable levels. Combined, of course, with the difficult job conditions, employment conditions for emerging scholars. So it is a really serious problem, and we're thinking about it in two ways. There's the question of whom we're recruiting for doctoral programs, and I come back to that. I'm kind of ashamed to say it now, but when I was an active faculty member in the undergraduate classroom, it's been a few years since I've been there now, but for almost 20 years, I had pretty much one question in mind. I would look at my often very brilliant seminars at UW, Stanford, and then NYU for a long time, and I would think, I'd look at a student and I'd say, oh, I think that was such a great seminar paper he wrote. He's going to do really well. I'm going to talk to him in the hallway after class about applying to graduate school. That, producing the seminar paper was really the main measure. And we clearly have to think much more broadly about the kinds of talents we want in the academy. And that's something that, especially this group in the Intention Foundry, is trying to shake us up about. The second issue I didn't have time to touch on, but I'll just mention now, is the question of vernacular and the languages in which we write. Tressie McMillan Cottom had a really interesting piece, I think, in the Chronicler of Higher Education recently, because it is the problem with social media. It came across some feed, but Tressie McMillan Cottom is a very interesting thinker and writer about the power of writing and her passion for writing and her passion for articles and books, but her equal, if not stronger, passion in expanding the styles in which academics write. And that's another issue for the Intention Foundry participants, speaking right to the questioner's concern. Their question is, their frustration is, why do I have to learn an entirely different style of English in which to write in order to be taken seriously and gain legitimacy as a thinker? So that's another question for us to think hard about.
Those of you who are on the Pathable chat know that there's a very lively discussion taking place there that I will share with Joy after. We will have time for two more questions. I'll do one from here and then one from the audience. This one is pretty straightforward but interesting, from Amy Freeman. Do you think that libraries can also contribute to this discussion by supporting the creation of public knowledge through technical expertise, or by offering tools? By that I mean make public scholarship easier and less time consuming, and therefore more tenable for busy scholars.
Absolutely, yes.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, and I would hope that through this meeting with you and people attending virtually too, that we can learn how to do that more effectively together.
And there is a good link now to the public knowledge report in the chat. Last question we'll take from the floor, and then our time will run out. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Heather Staines from Delta Think, and I want to ask a question about professional societies. I've been getting the sense, for the past half dozen years at least, there's a disconnect with folks who are coming up through the system, postdocs, but even younger than that, and what professional societies can actually do for them. I mean, way back in dinosaur days when I started working on my dissertation, you got your subscriptions through your professional society. Then when that mainly happened through the library, it was the networking at conferences, it was the interviewing at conferences. And now that conferences are in question and a lot of interviews are happening online and kind of cutting the societies out, how can societies stay relevant and continue to have a robust benefit for these junior scholars?
Yeah, really good question, and something we think about at ACLS for obvious reasons every day. Two brief answers, and there is more to say. One, because of that systemless system aspect of higher education, which is also a brutal hierarchy, right, where the values and practices and habits of extremely well-resourced colleges and universities tend to be taken as the coin of the realm, whether people, I mean, often people point that out with a frown and say, like it or not, because they do it that way at X school, I've got to think about a way to do it at my school, even though we don't have the resources, we don't have the staff, we don't have the student culture, it's a completely different entity. So, so given that we live in this brutal hierarchy with unequal resources, the societies are really one of the only ways in which people can connect. I think of this very personally. I think the first time because I had the privilege to go to private schools for good or for bad, but mostly for good, I think, for me, in terms of the wonderful education I got. But my sphere of experience was so limited, so radically limited. And the Society for Classical Studies was the first time at an annual meeting I met a community college professor, and that opened up whole spheres or lines of perspectives onto academia that I hadn't had before. So so in terms of connective tissue in a highly unequal resource landscape, societies have that function. The second is the clearinghouse of information about what works, and what doesn't. Experiments, efforts to change the system that are happening like mushrooms, all over the country, indeed all over the world, and actually all over. I want to underline all over the world, because one of the things I hear from our international programs, people at ACLS, is the resource, the creative imagination that we can draw on, and the actual practices and histories we can draw on from the ways universities are designed outside the US and outside North America. Very different often, really inspiring. They work. We don't have to have 12 departments of languages and literatures in every university. We can really organize the study of the humanities and social sciences very differently. It's being done differently in Egypt and Nigeria and parts of Australia, and there's a lot to learn. So the societies can be a clearinghouse for that too.
Very good. It's conventional at this point to ask you to thank the speaker, but I want you to thank this one particularly vigorously for putting on such a lifelike appearance this morning. Her plane landed at 1:45 this morning, and she has gone through an ordeal just to be here, not only to give us the fine presentation that she did. So please join me, Joy, in thanking.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Great.